That brings us into the 1870s, probably the single most impactful decade in history for Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. And it's all tied in to this guy, the American bison, technical name bison, more commonly known, of course, as the buffalo.
There were millions of buffalo on the Great Plains, more than enough to sustain the tribes that lived there, and as you know, depended upon those herds for all kinds of things, not just for food and clothing, but for ritual, ceremony, and identity. Really, there was some limited trade in buffalo robes before 1870, but it was very limited. Buffalo robes were very heavy and very warm, but you could only get them from the herds in the northern plains where it was colder, where their coats grew longer, and then you could only get those coats in the wintertime. Also, you had to, if you wanted to get them to sell, you would have to wander out onto the plains, which were controlled by these various tribes who would not be very friendly toward the idea. So now some tribes, some Indians, did trade individual buffalo robes, but it was a very small operation, and that changed. That changed as a result of something that happened in 1870 when a new technique was perfected that made tanning buffalo hides in particular for industrial purposes much easier to do, and it could be done in great numbers. So that gave the hides significant value because with the ability to tan them and turn them into really high quality leather, there was a demand for that, especially in Europe. Turns out buffalo hides, which are very thick, really good. And remember, we're not talking about the fur, but the hide underneath the fur. Turns out they're very good for making very durable shoe soles and for making very durable belts, and in particular, industrial belts that were used on heavy machinery. And bear in mind, this is around the time that second industrial revolution is kicking off, and there's a lot of factory expansion. So suddenly there's a big demand for buffalo hides. So what happened is that enterprising white people, particularly in the southern plains, started going out and killing huge amounts of buffalo for their hides. Now, why in the southern plains? In part because the northern plains were still pretty well controlled by the Lakota and their allies. The southern tribes by 1870 had, at least nominally, except for the Quahati Comanches, gone onto the reservations, even though, so far as whether they stayed there or not was a different story. But the real reason, the biggest reason that this took off in the southern plains was because of the Transcontinental Railroad, which passed through Kansas, right? That is why so many cattle towns sprung up in Kansas, like Dodge City and Abilene, because that's where the cowboys in Texas would drive their cattle. They would drive them up to Kansas because that's where the trains were. Well, that's also where the trains were to transport buffalo hides. So people started coming out and hunting buffalo, and hunting is well, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration for what it really was, because you didn't really have to hunt for them. You know, a buffalo herd might have 100,000 animals in it, not that hard to find. And if you knew what you were doing and you played your cards right, it wasn't hard just to shoot them all day long. You would have to have someone there pouring water over your rifle barrel to keep it from melting because you were shooting so much. And that's because, well, buffalo are noble creatures, but they're not that bright. If you've got a herd and you start shooting the ones on the end, not the ones in the middle, but if you start shooting the ones on the end, the others don't pay much attention. And then you can work your way toward the middle and kill a whole lot of them before they really even, notice what's going on, because there's all that yummy grass to be concerned with. So one hunter in a season could kill thousands of buffalo. And, well, in 1870, a buffalo hide was pretty much worthless. You couldn't get any money for it. By the next year, you could get $2.80 for one hide. And that price that price range stayed about the same for the next 10 or 15 years, between $2.30 and $2.80. So average of $2.50 per hide. If you were working as a cowboy and you were an experienced cowboy, you weren't just a green hand, the best you could hope to make was maybe $50 a month. But you could go out and shoot thousands of buffalo and get a couple of bucks a piece for them. So that's a lot of money, and that's a lot of temptation. A lot of people from all walks of life who lived in the southern plains, we're talking about white people, well, not all white, but non-Indians. And a lot of people came into the area expressly to get in on this because it was a guaranteed money-making venture. So there were buffalo just being slaughtered in huge, huge numbers. And the hides were being sold, taken to the railway, shipped off to Europe for the sale for leather for the most part, but other parts were used as well. Their bones could be used to make glue, just like horse and cattle bones. This is a famous photograph from 1892 of a giant mountain of buffalo skulls, not in Kansas, but in Detroit, where they had been shipped by rail, probably getting ready to go into the glue works. Another use was buffalo tongue, which was regarded as a delicacy and was in great demand in a lot of restaurants in the eastern United States and in Europe. But now, in 1870, the period that we're talking about right now, they weren't shipping the skeletons or the skulls off to Detroit. They were just killing thousands of them and skinning them, taking the hides, maybe the tongues, but leaving the rest there to rot. So here's the numbers. In 1870, there were about 5.5 million buffalo in the United States. By one decade later, it was 395,000. At the end of that decade, the 1880s, 541. And really, the only reason there were 541 left is that some ranchers who had buffalo on their property, particularly in the northern plains, kept them. They prevented them from being killed or processed, just because they were a novelty. By 1900, there were only 300, and then over the course of the 20th century, that number very, very slowly went up, and today, anywhere between 350,000, 400,000. So back to 1880 numbers, roughly. This is obviously going to affect the Southern Plains tribes who are relying on these herds for their sustenance because, even the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, Southern Arapaho, who had gone onto the reservations in western Oklahoma, were still at that point, they were still allowed to go on buffalo hunts, and they still were reliant almost completely on buffalo to feed themselves and their people. So all of a sudden, thousands and thousands and thousands of buffalo being killed every day, of course, that's going to impact them, and it is going to create a lot of friction that is going to lead to a major Indian war. Now, I'm going to go ahead now and mention this, even though we're currently talking about the Southern Plains, just so that I don't forget later, and because we're on the topic of buffalo. But later on, later in the 1870s, when the U.S. is at war with the Lakota Alliance in the Northern Plains, the U.S. Army will implement the policy of just killing buffalo, as many as they can, wherever they can, not because they're hunting them, not because they're taking their hides or anything else, just to kill the buffalo because they're trying to defeat the Lakotas and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. And the fastest way to help do that is to destroy their food supply. So that's not the intention in the Southern Plains in the early 1870s. It is just the practical effect. I mean, the fact is, all those former cowboys and former various other professions that are out there making money killing all these buffalo, they don't really care whether Indians can eat or not, because this is an opportunity for them to make a lot of money quickly. Let's take a look at several significant leaders among the Kiowa circa 1870. We've got pictured here Satanta, which means white bear, Satank, or sitting bear, and Wipago, alias lone wolf. Those three were known as the war leaders. There were other leaders of other bands as well that operated with them, but they were the ones that principally in the late 1860s, early 1870s, were still engaging in raids. On the lower right, that guy Adoete, a much younger leader, a much younger chief, alias Big Tree, was one of those who followed the lead of what you might call the Big Three up there on top. And then you've got Tene Angopte, alias Kicking Bird, who was at this point known primarily for his peaceful intention, his desire to be accommodating and to basically to live peaceably, even though in his career he had been a military leader and had led many raids. Kicking Bird had signed on to the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867, and so had Satanta, or White Bear, although Satanta signed on to it with the agreement he would lead his people onto that reservation in Oklahoma, and he was really slow in doing that. Didn't look like he was even going to, so Custer actually took him hostage until his people relocated to Oklahoma, which probably didn't improve Satanta's attitude toward the treaty and the government very much. Anyway, after going on to the reservation, and by the way, Lone Wolf did not sign on to that treaty. He didn't agree to it. But even those who did come onto the reservation in Oklahoma were, like I said, continuing to hunt buffalo, and sometimes continuing to go on raids against settlers in the area. Kicking Bird made the argument to the Indian agents, the government agents, that if only the government would provide the annuities they had promised and provide all of them and provide them on time, then maybe his people wouldn't be leaving the reservation to go hunt for buffalo and, be in the sort of bad mood that they were in. Now, some of these other ones, the quote unquote war leaders, didn't make excuses. They had no intention of no longer hunting buffalo. That was their lifestyle. And even though they were theoretically supposed to be on the reservation all the time, they didn't pay too much attention to that because they hadn't, many of them hadn't even agreed to do it. Eventually, by the way, in 1870, Kicking Bird felt compelled because he was getting so criticized by the other Kiowa leaders for being a sellout, really, that he led a raid himself against a ranch that ended up having the company of cavalry attacking them, and the Kiowa under Kicking Bird actually got the upper hand, and he demonstrated his martial skill that he had when he was younger, and sort of saved face. And by showing that he could still get out and fight, people continued to follow him. But that was the last time Kicking Bird would engage in any violence against the United States. And that was not the case for the rest of these guys. On May 18th, 1871, a force of about 180 Kiowa warriors left the reservation in western Oklahoma and went southward into Texas. They were led by Satanta, Satonk, and Big Tree. They came upon a small army convoy, an ambulance and some attendants, 18 people total, and decided to let it go past. There was some discussion as to whether or not to attack it, but it seemed like it was too small. And so they let that one go because there was a larger wagon train further down the road. Now, the military, that were the people who were in that small convoy, had no idea that they were under observation from 180 Kiowa warriors and almost had been attacked. And it's an interesting what if scenario, because that little group of soldiers actually was the bodyguard of General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the commanding general of the United States Army, stationed, of course, in Washington, D.C., who had come out west to tour the forts and see how things were going. So they almost had Sherman, but they let him go. And then later, when Colonel Ronald McKenzie of the 5th Cavalry informed Sherman of what had almost happened, Sherman was incensed. He took it very personally that there had been, unbeknownst to him, a very real threat on his life. Instead, the Kiowas attacked the wagon train that is known as the Warren Wagon Train. It was not a wagon train of settlers heading west or anything. It was actually teamsters in the employ of Henry Warren, who was along for the ride here. He was an independent contractor who was working for the U.S. Army, and these wagons were delivering corn, actually, to several different forts along that route. There were a dozen teamsters altogether, and they were attacked by these Indians, and they circled the wagons literally for a better defense. They were attacked. Seven of the teamsters were killed, and their bodies mutilated. 5 of them managed to get away and report what had happened. The Kiowas, meanwhile, after this, they got 40 mules, and headed back north and went back to the reservation. By the way, the illustration here is a painting titled "The Warren Wagon Train Raid," and it was painted by Buck Taylor, who played Newly on Gunsmoke and occasionally shows up in the current TV series Yellowstone. He's a pretty good artist in addition to being an actor. Sherman and Mackenzie immediately set about trying to figure out who was involved in that raid, and specifically who had led it. And they were helped significantly by the fact that Satanta was going around bragging that it had been him, Satonk, and Big Tree, and that word of that got out pretty quickly. So troops were sent to Fort Sill to arrest those three chiefs. When Lone Wolf became aware of this, he armed himself to the teeth and showed up to defend his friends. But turns out there were a whole lot of soldiers, because Sherman came personally and arrested and handcuffed these three chiefs and ordered them to be sent to Jacksboro, Texas, to stand trial for murder. This was going to be the first time that any Native American leaders in the West would be tried in a federal court. Now, this is different from what happened in Minnesota with the Dakota Uprising, because those were local courts. This is a federal court. So they are they're handcuffed and they're to be transported to Jacksboro, Texas. Satonk was to be transported by wagon. Actually, they all were, I think, separately. Anyhow, he was the only one in this particular wagon, and he refused to get in it. He had no intention of being put on a sham trial, and he said that his relatives would find his body along the road before he would show up for a trial. So he was forced into the wagon. He was thrown into the back of it, and he had with him a red blanket, and he just sort of covered himself over with his blanket and huddled in the corner of the wagon. And the soldiers assumed that he was distraught and he was trying to hide his face in humiliation, but he was actually hiding the fact that he was gnawing away at his own wrists, biting the flesh off his own wrists so he could slip out of those handcuffs and get at the knife that he had hidden in his clothing. And eventually, along the road, he did just that. And he came out from under that red blanket with his knife and stabbed and killed one of the guards and grabbed his gun, and then went down in a hail of bullets from the other troops before he had an opportunity to fire. So he did not go through the humiliation of being put on trial. He went down fighting. The other two, Satanta and Big Tree, were taken, and they were tried, and they were convicted, and they were sentenced to death. Now, this is 1871. This is toward the end of Grant's first administration. He had already put his peace policy in place, and he had already put Quakers in charge of the Indian affairs. And some of those Quakers prevailed upon the governor of Texas to commute the sentences of these two Kiowa leaders to life in prison rather than execution. So they were taken to prison. Lone Wolf and Kicking Bird both started working immediately to try to effect the release of Satanta and Big Tree. In fact, Lone Wolf traveled to Washington, D.C. and spoke directly with President Grant. Finally, after 2 years, in September 1873, the two of them were released from prison and allowed to return to the reservation. Ado Ete, alias Big Tree, that was enough for him. He had had enough adventure to last him, I guess, for a while, so he didn't get involved in any of the activities that took place after that, so far as resistance to the U.S. government. And he would remain a chieftain of his band until he died about 50 years later. Satanta was a different story. So they'd been in prison 2 years. They go back home, and buffalo are very, very, very scarce by this point. And many Kiowa and their Comanche and Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies are getting pretty fed up with it. And Satanta gets involved with what happens next. Now, once again, Adobe Walls is going to enter our narrative. The, uh, the location of Bent's trading post way back in the 1840s, the site where Kit Carson's soldiers had that battle with the Southern Plains Indians back in 1864. Well, by 1874, the buffalo hunters had really thinned out the herds in Nebraska and Kansas. And to get to the good hunting, they had to move farther south into what one of them described as hostile Indian country, because the area, you see, between the Arkansas River and the Canadian River had been set aside by treaty as hunting grounds for those Southern Plains tribes. But that's where the buffalo are, right? Because the buffalo hunters have killed the majority of them that were in other nearby areas. So they start operating here, which is bringing things even closer to home for the Comanches and Kiowas and their allies. Quite a few buffalo hunters were operating illegally in this area, and they had sort of set up, or some people had set up, kind of a base at Adobe Walls. They had built up the main building, which had crumbled into ruins. It had been pounded by cannon fire and other stuff in previous years, and so a little community sprang up. It once more became a trading post, like it had been back in the 1840s, with buffalo hunters coming in and out, bringing their hides to trade. Various buildings got erected there. As you can see, there's a saloon, a blacksmith shop. There was over to the left, you can see Myers and Leonard's store, which had a stockade, a wooden fence built around this area where the well was, and I'm assuming that was probably an outside structure that was the mess hall, kind of like a pavilion. And then over to the right, you see the Rath and Wright store, which is actually on the ruins, the rebuilt ruins of the old Bent's trading post. It's got that little courtyard in the middle. And there's some outbuildings. There's an outbuilding there. There's a big pile of hides, which is where they were located on the particular day in question. Now, in early June of 1874, a couple of, well, more than a couple, some buffalo hunters kind of, well, they lost their hair in a painful way. They were working frequently in pairs, and Comanches and Kiowas came through on raids, joined sometimes by Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho. And they had caught one pair of guys out working alone and killed them. Then they caught another pair and killed them. And as word got around about that, more and more of the buffalo hunters stayed closer to the old Adobe Walls. And so on this particular day, there were 28 people total at this little Adobe Walls settlement, including Bat Masterson. In the past, when I've taught classes where I mentioned the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. Spoiler alert, that's what this is going to be. I'll make some comment along the lines of, and guess who was there? Bat Masterson. Fully expecting everyone to know what I was talking about, only to be greeted by puzzled looks from most of the class. So I will take a moment to tell you who Bat Masterson was and why that's significant. Bat Masterson was one of the most famous of the Old West lawmen slash gunfighters. Here's a picture of him taken 2 years after the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, when he was the deputy marshal in Dodge City, Kansas. And he's standing there with his fellow deputy marshal and good friend, Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was not at Adobe Walls, but I put up this particular picture just to give you some context, because most people have heard of Wyatt Earp nowadays. And if you have, you're aware Wyatt Earp went on to become Marshal. Bat Masterson went on to become the county sheriff there in Dodge City in Ford County, Kansas. So Bat Masterson was one of the people that was there. In fact, he was, when the attack started, he was in the saloon, which perhaps should not be surprising. On the morning of June 27th, about 700 warriors came charging down from the northeast at the settlement. It was Comanches and Kiowas, with a small contingent of Southern Cheyenne as well. The Comanche leaders included Quanah Parker. The Kiowa leaders included Lone Wolf and Satanta, alias White Bear. So they came sweeping in. The Shadler brothers were asleep in their wagon outside the stockade. They had a very short day, so they were killed. A third person was killed as he was trying to run into one of the buildings. Everyone else was either already inside or made it inside, and they had the doors bolted and they had shutters on the windows. And the Indians came close enough that they were pounding on the doors and windows with the butts of their rifles. They had come in so quickly that the buffalo hunters' long-range buffalo guns were not effective, so they had to resort to smaller arms. However, they did succeed in killing several of the warriors, who then pulled back farther back there to the hills and basically besieged the settlement in a siege that went on for several days. Several days into the siege, actually near the end of it, one of the hunters named Billy Dixon had his buffalo gun, and there were several Indians on the top of that hill up there at the top of the picture that were taking a look. That was almost a mile away. And Dixon took a shot at them and admitted himself it was a lucky shot. He admitted himself that he could not be accurate at that distance, but it was lucky indeed, because he shot one of the warriors out of his saddle and killed him. And when the other warriors saw that they weren't safe almost a mile away, they pulled back rather than continuing to assault the settlement. So the buffalo hunters lost 3 guys in that very first assault. Then they lost one more about 3 or 4 days into the siege, but that was an accident. That was a guy accidentally shot himself in the head with his rifle while he was climbing up a ladder. And those were the only deaths among the buffalo hunters. It's impossible to tell how many deaths there were on the other side, because the warriors rode up and retrieved the bodies of their fallen comrades. However, when the fighting was all done, there were 15 bodies, 15 Native American bodies that were close enough to the walls of the settlement that their comrades had not been able to safely come and get them. Quanah Parker was among those wounded during the incident. He was wounded toward the end of it. Once again, the biggest factor in the Indians' defeat was technology, and new technology available to their adversaries. Now, the buffalo hunters, almost all of them, were carrying Sharp's Big 50 caliber gun that has an extremely long range. Billy Dixon was using Sharps when he shot that guy from almost a mile away. However, the initial assault, those didn't do much good. They also, several of them had Winchesters. The Winchester there shown on top, the 1866 model, known as the Yellow Boy because of the brass plating on it, looked just like an 1860 Henry rifle, which was the first repeating rifle, lever action. The Henry, however, you had to load it. I think it had 16 rounds. You had to load it by tilting it up and dropping the bullets one by one down the loading tube. You didn't have to stand up to do that. You could still be in a prone position, but you had to tilt the gun up and stretch up. And that was, that was sort of inconvenient when people were shooting at you. Oliver Winchester bought the company that made the Henry, and in 1866 released a modified and improved version of it. Some people called it the improved Henry, but it technically was called, for the first time, a Winchester. And among other improvements, the loading mechanism was changed. With the Winchester, you loaded it one bullet at a time by sticking them into this spring-loaded thing right there on the side of the rifle. So you didn't have to kneel, stand up, or in any way expose yourself. It was a lot easier to do, and you could reload a lot more quickly. Winchester made even more improvements in its 1873 model, which had a steel frame, had increased accuracy and power, and fired 17 rounds in the full-size version as opposed to 15. Now, most of the buffalo hunters had either an 1866 or an 1873 Winchester, which they were able to use in closer quarters than the Sharp's Big 50, which was a gun that you basically loaded one shell at a time. They also had sidearms. We talked before about the Walker Colt, introduced back in the 1840s, initially for the Texas Rangers, the first really effective repeating handgun or revolver. Colt had made a lot of advances in the meantime. In 1860, the Army model of the Colt revolver in 44 caliber was introduced, and that was a sidearm used by both sides in the Civil War. There was a smaller one, the Navy Colt, that was 36 caliber. Like the Walker, they were cap and ball. You had to load each chamber with gunpowder and put the round bullet in it. However, in 1873, Colt introduced what came to be known as the Peacemaker, which was the first handgun to use cartridges. So a lot easier, a lot faster to load. And then immediately afterward, there was a mechanism introduced. It was called a Richards conversion, in which you could take your 1860 Army or Navy Colt and convert it over so that it could fire cartridges. Again, making it easier to load and reload. So there was one Colt Peacemaker among the buffalo hunters, because it had only been out for a year. But there were a lot of Richards converted Colts from Army and Navy Colts. The point is, the The warriors were attacking. They mostly had lances, bows and arrows. The guns that they had would have been older model guns that were not repeaters in most cases. And the buffalo hunters had this. Each one of them had this small arsenal in which he could fire many, many shots in a minute, and that's what enabled them to hold off the wave of attackers. Incidentally, there pictured on the left is my own 1860 Army Colt reproduction, but it's not 150 years old, but it does work just like the original. This is hanging just to my right in my office at home where I'm recording this. Unfortunately, they frown on me hanging up guns and Bowie knives and stuff in my office on campus. Now, probably the buffalo hunters were all using those Sharps Big 50s. The gun that was most commonly in use in the plains before that was the Hawken Plains rifle, which was a muzzle-loading weapon. And that's not really entirely relevant. I just wanted to show you mine. As you can see, I need a new ramrod, but it also is operational.